Hello, my name is Peter Bringe, pastor at Covenant Family Church. This year, this month, is the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Pilgrims to the New World. And it's an event that should be appreciated by all Americans, and especially by Christians who can appreciate the religious heritage as well that the Pilgrims brought with them, and important, of course, for our country. It's fitting that we remember them in this 400th year, particularly as this past year has been one that many people have described as with instability, being unprecedented and unusual in many ways. Because remember, when the Pilgrims came, their world was very uncertain, full of trials and difficulty. There was persecution, religious persecution in England, which they felt first as those who had gone out of the Church of England, but even reform-minded Puritans in England would soon find persecution there as well. There was also in Holland difficulties, where economic difficulties as refugees in a foreign land, as well as the possibility that they would lose their religious and cultural identity there. There was problems in Dutch society, as in any society, and especially there was the coming of war. The beginnings of the 30 Years' War were starting in Europe, and a truce that had kept the peace between Spain and Holland was expiring, and they knew there would be war coming there as well. And then they decided to go to plant a colony in the New World, and that too was full of difficulty and danger and uncertainty as they had the journey across the Atlantic Ocean and then planting a settlement in the wilderness with various unknown dangers, and indeed half of them dying the first winter. Now, what held them together then to persevere, to stand by one another, and to endure those hardships and to build something for the future? Well, I think one key aspect of it was how seriously they took the concept of covenant, covenanting, particularly their covenant with God, and then implications of that for the rest of their life. In our day, because it's generally been more comfortable than most ages, we can get away with a tendency to emphasize kind of an atomistic freedom, each person for themselves, whatever you feel like at the moment, and emphasizing this freedom to the neglect sometimes of our obligations to one another. This was different, though, in most history, where people knew that they depended upon each other, and particularly upon the covenants that they made. Whether we're talking about the Old Testament Israel, or the feudal era in the Middle Ages, or talking about the Pilgrims, that a covenant, a solemn, sacred bond between people with mutual promises held them together as a society. Of course, for the Pilgrims, the most fundamental covenant was the covenant that God had made with his people, that in grace and through the death and resurrection of Christ, he had been able to bring his people in to covenant with him, and he promised them salvation and to be their God, and that they pledged to be his people and to walk in his ways, and had certain obligations as those who are bought with a price. And not only pledging themselves to God, but also to one another. And that is how they bound themselves to Christ's church in this covenant with God, and giving them also to binding themselves to one another. As Puritan John Cotton, who would later come to Boston, described in his catechism, something the Pilgrims would agree with. He says, "What doth the Lord bind his people to in this covenant? To give up themselves and their seed, first to the Lord to be his people, and then to the elders and brethren of the church, to set forward the worship of God and their mutual edification." So this church covenant, this covenant as God's people, was very important to the Pilgrims. It was the basis of their church, and they viewed themselves responsible to God and to and for one another and their mutual good. This would be tested throughout all of these trials as they went from one place to another. There was other covenants, though, that they would make and be obligated to keep. Most well-known one was their covenant as a body politic, today known as the Mayflower Compact. As they were about to land, and they saw the land there, they realized they were going to have to set up their own government, and so they covenanted and combined themselves as a civil body politic, not just the church members, but all of the men there, pledging themselves to one another, to call officers, to make laws, to submit to them, laws that would pursue the goals of the community, which was the advancement of the Christian faith, the honor of king and country, and the general good of the colony. And it was this Mayflower Compact, this community covenant, which bound them loyalty to one another, to support one another through very difficult times. That they knew themselves not to be just mere free agents out for themselves, but also with obligations to their community. They also made covenants with the people who financed the expedition, had to fulfill those obligations. Also made a peace treaty with the Wampanoag tribe and kept that faithfully in their generation. And so these agreements and the trustworthiness of them and fulfilling the obligations, not just in the moment, but going forward, is what held them together, that and God's blessing and providence during these difficult times. So the good things for us to think about today, to recognize the importance of covenant, its benefits, its obligations with God, with each other in our various realms, church, state, marriage covenant as well. This is the glue that holds us together and can hold us together, maintaining our identity as members of a family, our identity as God's people, and our identity as members of our community, as Americans, as well as members of our local communities, mutually pledged to each other's good. So let's remember the Pilgrims, the Puritans broadly speaking, their covenant theology, and let's put it into practice in our lives.